No one has danced with me for 5 years. Charlotte whispered to herself, the words lost in the hum of the crowded ballroom. The laughter of other couples mingled with the sound of the orchestra, but none of it touched her. She stood there, alone in the corner, watching as the world spun around her. Her gown, once elegant, now felt like a heavy cloak, trapping her in a world she no longer belonged to. The weight of the years she'd spent in solitude pressed on her chest, and every glance from the glittering crowd reminded her of her isolation. It hadn't always been this way. 5 years ago, she was the belle of the ball. Her family, though not the richest, was respected. Her beauty was admired, her smile sought after. But all that changed when her father's business failed, leaving them with nothing. Charlotte's world crumbled with the loss of their fortune. Invitations stopped coming. The whispers started, and soon, she was forgotten. As she watched the couples glide gracefully across the floor, her heart ached with a longing she couldn't name. She had once dreamed of a love like the ones she saw in the stories, passionate, all-consuming. But now, those dreams felt like a distant memory, like something that belonged to someone else. She wasn't sure how long she stood there, lost in her own thoughts, when she felt it, the weight of a stare on her back. Slowly, she turned, her heart skipping a beat as her eyes met the piercing gaze of Duke Thomas Whitaker, the most feared man in all the land. His reputation preceded him, a man of power, cold and calculating. He was known for his indifference to the world, and yet, in that moment, his eyes were fixed on her. The room seemed to fade away, and for the briefest moment, it was as if they were the only two people in existence. His lips barely moved as he stepped toward her, his presence commanding the room's attention. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice low and steady, yet carrying an unmistakable authority. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She should have said no. He was a man of power, a man with a dark past. She was just a forgotten girl with nothing left to lose. But his gaze held her captive, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she found herself nodding. The music shifted, and he took her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle, as though he was afraid to break her. As they moved to the center of the floor, the whispers started. The room buzzed with confusion and excitement. No one could believe it. The Duke, who never danced, had chosen Charlotte. They glided across the floor in a dance that neither of them had expected. For a brief moment, Charlotte forgot the years of loneliness, the pain of being forgotten. In his arms, she felt seen. She felt alive. The world outside the ballroom no longer mattered. She was no longer just a forgotten girl. She was his partner. And for the first time in 5 years, she danced. But as the music played on, she couldn't shake the feeling that this dance was the beginning of something much more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. As the music swirled around them, Charlotte's heartbeat quickened, the Duke's touch gentle yet firm, pulling her into a world that seemed to belong only to them. His hand rested at her waist, steady, commanding yet somehow tender. She felt the tension in his grip, the years of solitude he must have endured. His eyes, dark and unreadable, never left hers. She swallowed the lump in her throat, unsure if this was a dream or reality. The room buzzed with hushed whispers, but she didn't care. For the first time in so long, she felt seen. The Duke's presence, so powerful, so overwhelming, made her forget the years of being ignored. His gaze softened ever so slightly as they continued to dance, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the usual coldness she had come to expect from him. They moved gracefully, their bodies swaying in perfect unison. Yet, Charlotte felt a knot form in her stomach. This man, this Duke, was not someone she could easily trust. His reputation alone spoke volumes, and the whispers that followed him had not been kind. But in that moment, none of it seemed to matter. All she could focus on was the way his touch made her feel alive, the way his eyes seemed to study her, as though trying to understand something hidden deep within her. Her thoughts raced, her emotions a whirlwind of confusion. He was so different from the men she had known, cold, distant, and yet something about him drew her in. Maybe it was the way he had approached her, the way he had whispered those 3 simple words that changed everything. "Dance with me." Was it genuine? Or was he simply toying with her? She didn't know, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. But there was no denying the magnetic pull between them, the connection she had never felt with anyone else. For a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, to forget about the ballroom and the harsh whispers of the world. She surrendered to the dance, her body moving naturally with his. It felt so right, so perfect, as though they were meant to be together in this space, in this time. But as the music came to an end, Charlotte's heart sank. The Duke's gaze hardened once more, the softness from moments before gone. He stepped back, releasing her from his embrace. The spell was broken, and reality came crashing down. "Thank you," Charlotte whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned, his figure disappearing into the crowd as quickly as he had appeared. She stood there, breathless, her heart racing, unsure of what had just happened. The whispers began again, louder this time, but they felt distant. She didn't care. The dance had been everything. And in that fleeting moment, Charlotte knew she had experienced something far beyond her imagination. The Duke, the most feared man in the kingdom, had made her feel more alive than she ever thought possible. But as the night wore on, Charlotte couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than either of them. The days following the dance were filled with whispers and longing. Charlotte found herself walking through the halls of her family's estate, her mind constantly replaying the moment she had shared with Duke Thomas Whitaker. She had tried to tell herself it meant nothing, that it was just a fleeting encounter in a crowded ballroom. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw his dark eyes, his steady presence that had made her feel seen for the first time in years. The other women at the court gossiped about her, but Charlotte could barely hear them over the rushing thoughts in her own mind. Why had he chosen her? What did it mean? She tried to avoid thinking about it, to keep her distance from the Duke, but fate had other plans. The next week, she found herself at another ball, though this time, her heart wasn't in it. The same faces, the same empty stares from the men who ignored her, and the same feeling of being out of place. But as the night wore on, she felt a familiar presence in the room. Her breath caught as her eyes found him across the floor. Duke Thomas Whitaker stood near the grand staircase, his eyes scanning the crowd. For a moment, it seemed like he was looking for someone. Their gazes locked, and she felt her heart skip a beat. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination, but it felt like he was moving toward her. He didn't hesitate, his steps purposeful as he walked through the sea of people. The room seemed to fade away as he neared her. "May I have this dance?" His voice was low, commanding, yet there was a softness to it. Charlotte's heart raced. She had told herself she wouldn't fall for him, that she wouldn't get swept up in the fantasy of a duke noticing a woman like her. But standing there, staring up at him, she realized that she was already lost. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Without a word, he took her hand and led her to the center of the ballroom. The music began, and they moved together, effortlessly, as though they had danced this way 1,000 times before. Charlotte could hardly believe it. The Duke, the most feared man in all the kingdom, was holding her close, his touch steady and warm. She felt a sense of belonging she hadn't known in years. The room around them faded, and it was just the two of them, lost in the rhythm of the dance. The whispers from earlier, the doubts, the fears, all disappeared. She had never felt more alive, more seen, than in that moment. The dance was intimate, and though they said nothing, everything was being said through the way they moved together. As the music came to an end, Charlotte felt a pang of loss. She didn't want the moment to end, didn't want to go back to the world where she was invisible. But the Duke, as if reading her thoughts, didn't release her immediately. Instead, he held her for a moment longer, his gaze intense. "I've never met anyone like you," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. Charlotte's heart fluttered, unsure of what to say. What did he mean? Was it the truth, or was it just part of the game? She didn't know, but for the first time in years, she didn't care. All that mattered was the way he made her feel, important, seen, cherished. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this than a dance. But as he stepped back, the reality of their world crept in again. He was a duke. She was just a woman with nothing left to offer. And yet, something inside her stirred, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The days that followed the dance felt like a blur to Charlotte. She could not escape the image of the Duke's dark eyes, the way his presence commanded the room, and the way he had held her, as though nothing else mattered. She told herself it was just a moment, a fleeting fantasy, something that wouldn't happen again. But when she least expected it, she found herself standing across from him once more. The next ball was approaching, and despite her best efforts to avoid it, she found herself drawn back into the world of high society. Charlotte hadn't received a direct invitation, but it seemed impossible to stay away. As the day of the ball arrived, her thoughts kept returning to him. She couldn't stop wondering why he had looked at her like that, why he had danced with her. The Duke was not a man to waste his time on just any woman. Yet here she was, a woman who had been invisible to society for years. It didn't make sense. And yet, it haunted her, gnawing at her thoughts with every passing minute. The evening arrived in full splendor. The ballroom was a vision of grandeur, the walls draped in golden fabric, the chandeliers casting soft light on the elegantly dressed guests. Charlotte walked into the room, trying to ignore the pit in her stomach. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her as they always did, but it was different this time. She wasn't sure if it was because of the Duke or because she had finally begun to feel something she hadn't felt in so long: hope. She had barely stepped onto the dance floor when she saw him. Duke Thomas Whitaker, standing in his usual spot, near the far side of the room. His eyes scanned the crowd, and Charlotte's breath caught in her throat as their gazes met. There it was again, that pull. He was looking for her. She felt her heart race. Without a word, he began walking toward her, his presence filling the space between them. The crowd seemed to part as he approached, all eyes on the two of them. Charlotte's pulse quickened, her thoughts racing. Was this real? Or was she imagining it? But as he stood before her, the weight of his gaze made it clear, this was not a dream. Charlotte. He said her name softly, as though it was something he had practiced. His voice was low, rich with authority, yet there was something else in it, something that made her feel like she was the only person in the room. Dance with me, he repeated. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For a moment, she felt as if she couldn't breathe. She should have said no, should have pulled away and reminded herself of the danger in getting involved with someone like him. But her heart told her otherwise. She nodded, her hand reaching out toward him. He took it without hesitation, and for the second time, they moved together on the floor. This time, there were no doubts in her mind. She felt his touch as if it were a lifeline, something that steadied her, pulled her into his world. The room around them faded as they danced, their steps in perfect rhythm. Charlotte could feel the eyes of the guests on them, but it didn't matter. She was with him, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more. As the music played on, their connection deepened, silent words passing between them. The world outside the dance floor seemed distant, as though it no longer existed. For the first time in years, Charlotte felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. And as the final notes of the music played, he gently pulled her closer, his breath warm against her ear. "I've waited for this," he whispered, and Charlotte's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what would come next, but in that moment, she knew her life had just changed forever. The days after the ball felt like a strange whirlwind to Charlotte. Each moment she tried to step back into her daily routine, the Duke's presence lingered in her mind, like a shadow that refused to fade. Every glance from the staff, every smile from a guest, seemed to ask one question: what had changed? What had happened between her and the Duke? Charlotte couldn't quite answer, not yet. She had promised herself that she wouldn't let this change her, that she wouldn't allow herself to get swept up in something as fleeting as a dance. But each time she thought of him, her heart raced again. Her thoughts returned to that one moment when everything seemed to shift. It was impossible to ignore the weight of his words, the way he had whispered in her ear, "I've waited for this." She hadn't been able to grasp it then, but now the meaning was settling in her heart like a heavy stone. It had felt so simple, so perfect, but now she wondered whether it was just an illusion. He was a duke, a man of immense power, untouchable in many ways. What could a woman like her offer him, a woman who had been cast aside by society? Charlotte stood by the window in her room, gazing out at the garden below. The soft glow of the afternoon sun bathed everything in a golden light, but the world outside seemed distant and cold. Her mind was filled with images of the Duke, his dark eyes, his commanding presence. He had made her feel seen, something she hadn't felt in years. Yet, there was a hesitation in her heart, a fear that it was all too good to be true. Was she simply a distraction for him, a momentary break from his world of duty and power? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had no idea what this meant. And that uncertainty kept her at a distance, pulling away from the very thing she wanted most. But it wasn't long before fate had other plans. A week later, a letter arrived. It was unexpected, formal, and undeniably from the Duke himself. Her hands trembled as she held the delicate parchment, the royal seal on the back catching the light. She opened it carefully, her breath catching in her throat as she read the words. I request your presence at my estate, for dinner. Your company would be an honor. Thomas Whitaker, Duke of Greyhaven. Charlotte stared at the letter for a long time, her mind spinning. What did this mean? Why was he inviting her? Was this a gesture of politeness, or something more? Her heart raced as she thought of the possibilities. But the doubts quickly followed. She had seen enough of high society to know that nothing came without a price. Was this truly an invitation to get to know her, or just another form of entertainment for the Duke? She had never been someone who could read between the lines, never been able to decipher what people truly wanted. But something deep inside her told her that this was different. She didn't want to question it. She didn't want to doubt it. For the first time in so long, Charlotte felt like something could finally change in her life. So, she made her decision. The very next evening, Charlotte arrived at the Duke's estate. The grand gates loomed before her, and she felt a wave of nervousness wash over her. The estate was even more imposing up close, the stone walls towering over her, casting long shadows in the evening light. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, the sound of her heels echoing in the quiet as she walked up the path. When the door opened, she was greeted by the butler, who led her inside. The warmth of the house contrasted with the chill of the night air, and Charlotte was momentarily lost in the comfort of the space. But as she stepped further into the grand dining room, she saw him, the Duke, standing at the head of the table, his dark eyes fixed on her. For a brief moment, everything stopped. Her heart skipped a beat, and in that silence, she knew this was just the beginning. Charlotte entered the grand dining room, her footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors as the door closed behind her. The Duke's estate was as magnificent as it had seemed from the outside, the walls adorned with portraits of past generations, each one staring down with an almost regal detachment. At the center of the room stood Duke Thomas Whitaker, his eyes still fixed on her as she entered, the flickering candlelight casting shadows over his face. He was standing tall, dressed in dark, elegant attire that seemed to exude both power and authority. There was a subtle tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that something was about to change. Charlotte's heart fluttered as she crossed the room toward him. The quiet whispers of the staff faded into the background, and all she could focus on was the Duke. The gaze he held upon her was unlike any she had ever experienced. It wasn't just the look of a man who admired her. It was something deeper, something that seemed to understand her in a way no one else ever had. She felt exposed, vulnerable, yet strangely protected in his presence. Charlotte, he said her name with a calm, measured tone, as though he had been waiting for her all this time. I am glad you could join me tonight. His voice was rich, smooth, and she felt the warmth of it deep inside her. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. Thank you for inviting me, she replied softly, feeling a surge of nervousness she hadn't expected. I didn't know if I should come, she admitted, her words nearly lost in the silence between them. You were right to come, he said, stepping closer. His presence filled the room, and for a moment, Charlotte thought she might lose herself in the intensity of it. He gestured toward the table, where a feast had been laid out before them. The sight was nothing short of magnificent. Plates of roast meats, rich sauces, delicate fruits, and perfectly baked bread. The Duke motioned for her to sit, and as she did, he followed suit, sitting directly across from her. The conversation flowed easily between them, their words casual at first, yet with an underlying current of something more. Charlotte couldn't help but notice the way he listened to her, truly listened, as though every word mattered. For the first time in a long while, she felt important. But the more they talked, the more she felt a growing tension between them. There was something unspoken in the air, something she couldn't quite place. When they finished their meal, the Duke stood and walked toward the grand windows overlooking the estate. He turned slightly, his back to her, as though gathering his thoughts. Charlotte watched him, unsure of what to do next. The silence stretched between them like a fragile thread, ready to snap at any moment. Charlotte, the Duke said again, his voice low, carrying a weight she hadn't heard before. She stood, crossing the room slowly until she stood beside him, the cool night air brushing against her skin through the open window. I know I've kept you at a distance, he began, his gaze now fixed on the stars outside. But I cannot ignore what is between us any longer. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat, her heart beating louder with each passing second. Was this it? Was this the moment she had been waiting for? She started to speak, but he raised a hand, stopping her. No need for words right now, he said quietly, turning to face her fully. His eyes were intense, searching, as though trying to read her very soul. I only ask one thing from you, Charlotte. Her pulse quickened as she met his gaze. What is it? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Trust me, he said simply, his words hanging in the air between them. Trust me, and let me prove that what I offer is real. Charlotte stood there, torn between the doubts in her heart and the undeniable pull she felt toward him. The Duke, a man of power, had given her a glimpse of something more, something beyond the rigid world she had known. But could she truly trust him? Could she trust herself to follow this path? As she looked into his eyes, she felt the walls she had built around her heart begin to crumble. Maybe this was the beginning of something she had longed for. Maybe this was her chance at a new life, one filled with the promise of something real. But the decision was hers. Would she take the leap? Would she trust the Duke and step into a world unknown? The silence between them stretched, and Charlotte realized that the next move was hers to make. Charlotte stood there, the weight of the Duke's words pressing down on her chest. Trust me, he had said. It was the simplest request, yet it carried a burden she wasn't sure she was ready to bear. She had spent years building walls around her heart, protecting herself from the harsh realities of her world, and now, standing in front of him, she felt the cracks begin to form. She had always been cautious, always guarded, but there was something in Duke Thomas Whitaker that made her want to believe, to let go of her fears and take the leap. But could she? Her heart was telling her one thing, but her mind screamed for caution. The silence between them stretched, thick and suffocating, as Charlotte looked up at him. His expression was unreadable, his eyes dark, waiting for her response. For a moment, she wanted to look away, to escape the intensity of his gaze, but something inside her refused to move. She had never been one to take risks, but in that moment, standing in the Duke's presence, she realized that perhaps this was the risk she needed to take. I don't know if I can, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I've been hurt before. I've been forgotten. Her eyes fell to the floor, as though admitting her vulnerability made her weaker. But then she felt his hand, warm and steady, gently lift her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze once more. Charlotte, he said, his voice low and sincere. I'm not asking for anything except your trust. Nothing more. His words were a promise, though she wasn't sure if she could trust them just yet. I'll never ask you to do something you're not ready for, he continued, his hand still resting gently on her chin. But I need you to understand one thing. I see you. Not as a forgotten girl, not as someone lost in the shadows, but as someone who deserves to be seen, who deserves to be loved. Charlotte's breath hitched, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear. His words settled over her like a blanket, soothing the ache she had carried for so long. She had spent so much time hiding from the world, keeping her emotions locked away, but in that moment, she realized that maybe it was time to stop hiding. The Duke's presence was like a beacon, calling to her in ways she couldn't explain. She wasn't sure where this would lead, or what the future held, but for the first time, she felt the pull of something greater than herself. Her heart was racing, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Was she ready to trust him? To trust herself? Could she step into this world with him, a world that was so foreign to her, yet so intoxicating? She began, but the words faltered in her throat. She wasn't sure what to say, but before she could gather her thoughts, the Duke spoke again. You don't have to decide now, he said gently, his thumb brushing lightly across her cheek. But know this, I won't walk away. Not from you, not from what's between us. His words were a vow, a promise that made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. The uncertainty in her chest remained, but for the first time, it wasn't paralyzing. For the first time, it felt like hope. Charlotte nodded slowly, unsure of what the future held, but ready to step into it with him. She didn't know if she could fully trust him, not yet, but maybe, just maybe, she could take that first step. "I'm not asking for your heart," he whispered, his voice soft against the silence. "But give me your trust, Charlotte, and I'll show you what we can be together." The promise in his words was enough to make her breath catch in her throat. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of something she had long buried. It was hope, and it was terrifying, but it was also the beginning of something new. The days following the Duke's words felt like a slow, unspoken shift in the air. Charlotte spent each morning walking through the grand estate, the estate that once felt like a fortress, now feeling like a world she wasn't sure she belonged to. She found herself wandering through the vast gardens, her thoughts tangled in the promise he had made, in the trust he was asking for. The Duke had shown her a side of herself she wasn't sure existed anymore. She had spent years hiding behind walls, both built by others and by her own hands. Now, she was left wondering if it was possible to tear those walls down. Her heart tugged in a direction she wasn't ready to follow, but it was difficult to ignore the truth in his eyes, the sincerity that seemed to pull her in like gravity. Charlotte knew she couldn't live in this constant state of indecision, of fear. It wasn't like her. She had always been strong, always found her way, but now, standing on the precipice of something unknown, she wasn't sure where to step. One morning, after hours of walking, she returned to the Duke's study, where he had asked her to meet him. His presence filled the room, even before she stepped inside. He stood by the window, looking out over the horizon, his tall frame almost serene, as if he had been waiting for this moment just as much as she had. When he turned to face her, Charlotte noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes softened when they met hers. He stepped forward slowly, his gaze unwavering. "Charlotte," he began, his voice steady, but there was something beneath it, something vulnerable, almost raw. "I meant what I said. I won't ask you to make a decision tonight, but I need you to know that I am here, and I will be here. I won't leave you." His words hung in the air, and Charlotte felt a strange heat rise in her chest. His promise was clear, and it struck her deep within, but something still gnawed at her. Could she trust him completely? Could she take that leap? "I want to believe you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "But I've been hurt before. I've been let down. I don't know if I can trust anyone again." The Duke's expression softened, and he closed the space between them, standing just inches away. His hand gently reached for hers, his touch warm, steady. "Charlotte," he murmured, his voice almost a whisper, "I won't hurt you. I'm not like the others. I've been alone, just as you have. I understand what it means to guard your heart, but I want to show you that there's more than just the pain. There's a life beyond the hurt. If you'll allow me to, I want to walk beside you through it." Charlotte's heart hammered in her chest as his words wrapped around her like a blanket, soothing the fears she had buried for so long. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of his sincerity, to imagine a life where she wasn't afraid, where she could let someone else in. She had never considered that possibility before, but with him, in this moment, it felt like a possibility worth exploring. "I want to try," she said softly, her voice steady with the resolve she hadn't known she possessed. "I don't know what it looks like, but I want to try." The Duke's eyes brightened, a flicker of something deep in them that made Charlotte's heart leap. He reached for her hand, his grip firm yet gentle. "Then we begin," he said, a quiet determination in his voice. "Together." And for the first time in years, Charlotte believed it. The start of something new, something worth fighting for. Charlotte woke the next morning with a sense of clarity she had not felt in years. The events of the night before, the Duke's promise, still lingered in her mind, like a warm embrace that soothed the cold that had gripped her for so long. As the sun filtered through the curtains, she felt a shift inside her, a quiet, unspoken strength that had always been there, buried beneath her doubts and fears. She had made a choice. She had decided to trust him. And in doing so, she had chosen herself as well. The days that followed felt different. Each time she crossed paths with the Duke, there was a subtle change in the way they interacted, a gentle understanding that neither of them had to speak about. They shared stolen moments, brief glances, and small gestures that spoke volumes. The walls she had spent so long building around her heart were slowly coming down, and in their place, something new was growing. Something fragile but real. One evening, as they sat together in the Duke's study, the flickering fire casting soft shadows on the walls, Charlotte found herself looking at him in a way she hadn't before. He wasn't just the Duke anymore, the man of power and mystery. He was someone she had come to trust, someone who had shown her a side of herself she had long forgotten. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the world outside the study seemed to fade away. "Charlotte," he said, his voice low and sincere, "I want you to know that you are not alone in this. Whatever comes, whatever challenges we may face, we will face them together. I will be here, by your side." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of a promise she hadn't realized she had been waiting for. She felt a rush of emotion welling up inside her, a mixture of relief and hope. It had been so long since anyone had made her feel that way, so long since she had allowed herself to believe that someone could truly see her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for showing me that it's possible to trust again." He reached out, his hand brushing hers with a tenderness that made her heart flutter. "You don't have to thank me," he said softly. "This is just the beginning, Charlotte. We are just getting started." There was no grand gesture, no dramatic declaration of love. But in that quiet moment, Charlotte felt something shift deep inside her. She had come to realize that love wasn't something that could be rushed or forced. It wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations. It was in the small, everyday moments. The way someone made you feel safe, made you feel seen. The Duke had shown her that. And in return, she was showing him that she was ready to trust him, ready to let him into the world she had so carefully kept hidden. The days that followed were filled with small moments of shared laughter, quiet walks through the gardens, and conversations that seemed to stretch on forever, full of honesty and vulnerability. They were building something together, something real, something that was worth the risk. But even as their connection deepened, Charlotte knew that they were both walking a fine line. Trust was not something that came easily, and neither of them could predict what the future held. Still, as she stood beside him one evening, looking out over the estate they now shared, Charlotte felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had made a choice. She had chosen to trust, to love, to believe. And in that moment, she knew that whatever came next, she would face it with him by her side. As the weeks passed, Charlotte found herself settling into a rhythm she never thought possible. The Duke's presence in her life had become a steady comfort, something she hadn't realized she needed until he was there. Every morning, they would meet for breakfast, sharing quiet conversations that never seemed forced. The weight of the world outside the estate faded into the background, and for the first time in a long time, Charlotte felt like she could breathe. Yet, even as their bond grew stronger, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty that neither of them could ignore. Charlotte had allowed herself to believe in the Duke, in what they were building together, but the question remained. Could this truly be enough? Could love, real love, be something they could both trust? It wasn't just the past that haunted her, though that was always lurking in the shadows. It was the fear of the unknown. Would their connection survive the pressures of the world beyond these walls? The Duke had given her his trust, his promise, but Charlotte couldn't help but wonder if she was just another fleeting moment for him. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony overlooking the estate, the cool night air brushing past them, Charlotte felt a surge of courage. She turned to face him, her heart beating faster than she had expected. "Thomas," she said softly, her voice a mixture of uncertainty and determination, "I need to ask you something." He turned to her, his dark eyes steady, searching. "Anything," he replied, his tone gentle but with a quiet authority that made her feel as though this moment was important. "Do you see us, as something real?" she asked, her words barely above a whisper. "Because I know we have this connection, and I can feel what we're building, but there are times when I wonder if I'm just another fleeting distraction for you." She held her breath, afraid of his answer, afraid of what he might say. The silence stretched between them, but the Duke didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer to her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Charlotte," he began, his voice low and steady, "you are not a distraction. You are everything. What we have is real, and I have no intention of letting it slip away." His words wrapped around her like a lifeline, pulling her in with a strength she had never known. I didn't promise you forever that night because I knew that was something only time could prove, he continued, his hand reaching out to gently touch her cheek. But I'm not afraid of time with you. I'm not afraid of us. Charlotte's heart swelled, the doubt she had been carrying slowly fading away. There, in that moment, she realized something she had feared admitting. She was ready. She was ready to trust him completely. She had always feared losing herself in someone else, but the truth was, she had never felt more like herself than she did when she was with him. He had shown her a new world, one where she didn't have to hide, where she didn't have to be afraid. I trust you, Thomas, she said softly, her voice full of certainty now. I'm ready to see where this takes us. The Duke's face softened with a smile that reached his eyes, and in that moment, Charlotte knew that they had taken the first real step toward building something lasting, something real. She wasn't afraid anymore. Together, they could face whatever came next. As the days passed, Charlotte and the Duke's connection grew deeper, their trust in each other solidifying with every shared glance, every whispered word. The fears that once weighed heavily on Charlotte's heart were slowly lifted, replaced by a sense of peace she had never known. She spent more time with the Duke, accompanying him on walks through the gardens, sitting beside him in the study, and sharing quiet moments over dinner. Each moment felt like a promise, an unspoken bond that was becoming more real with each passing day. The Duke, once a figure of mystery and distance, had transformed before her eyes. He wasn't just a man of power and influence. He was a man with his own vulnerabilities, his own hopes, and Charlotte could see them now, clearly. He wasn't afraid to let his guard down with her. And for the first time in years, Charlotte realized that she was no longer the forgotten girl, standing in the shadows. She was seen, valued, and loved. One afternoon, as they walked through the estate's grand garden, the air rich with the scent of blooming roses, Charlotte felt a sudden rush of emotion. It was as though everything in her life had led to this moment. She had been so afraid of trusting, of allowing someone in, but now, with the Duke by her side, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. You make it so easy to trust you, Charlotte said softly, her voice almost lost in the wind. The Duke stopped walking, turning to face her. His dark eyes met hers with an intensity that sent a shiver through her. You make it easy to be trusted, he replied, his voice steady, yet warm. Charlotte felt her heart swell with emotion. She had never imagined a future like this, a future where she wasn't alone, where she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. I don't want to be afraid anymore, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to live in the shadows of my past. The Duke took a step closer to her, his hand gently brushing against hers. Then don't, he said softly, his words carrying the weight of a promise. We can move forward, together. The past doesn't have to define us. Charlotte's heart fluttered in her chest as she looked up at him. His gaze was unwavering, filled with an emotion she couldn't quite name. There was no hesitation in his eyes, no doubt. It was as though, in this moment, they were both ready to leave behind the ghosts of their pasts and step into something new, something beautiful. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her decision settle over her like a warm embrace. She was ready, ready to let go, ready to trust, ready to love. With the Duke by her side, she knew they could face anything. She could see it in the way he looked at her, the way he made her feel. It was a future she never thought possible, but it was real. It was theirs. And as the sun began to set over the horizon, painting the sky with shades of pink and gold, Charlotte realized that she was no longer afraid. The past was behind her, and the future was waiting. Together, they would write their own story. As the days turned into weeks, Charlotte found herself growing more and more certain of her place beside the Duke. The walls that had once confined her heart now seemed to crumble with each passing moment, each whispered conversation, each shared laugh. The Duke, once a figure of power and mystery, had become a constant presence in her life, a steady anchor in a world that had once felt like it was slipping away. Charlotte had never known a peace like this. She had never felt more at home, not in the grand halls of her family estate, nor in the circles of high society. It was here, with him, in the quiet moments they shared, that she had truly found her place. The Duke had opened her eyes to a future she had never dared to imagine. He was not just a man of power, but a man of depth, of understanding. Each day with him was a lesson in trust, in vulnerability, in love. And Charlotte, once so guarded, found herself giving more of herself than she ever thought possible. It was a slow process, but she was learning, and in return, he was showing her the strength in surrendering, the beauty in allowing herself to be loved. One evening, as the sun began to set over the estate, Charlotte and the Duke stood together on the balcony, watching the sky shift from gold to deep purple. The air was cool, the quiet evening settling around them like a blanket. "I never thought I'd find peace like this," Charlotte said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The Duke turned to her, his gaze steady, warm. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he replied, his words carrying a weight that made her heart skip. She looked up at him, her chest tightening with an emotion she couldn't quite name. She had always been afraid to let anyone in, afraid to trust, but now, standing beside him, she felt as though that fear had no place in her life anymore. "You've changed everything for me," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "You've shown me that I don't have to be afraid, that I don't have to hide anymore." The Duke's hand reached for hers, his touch gentle but sure. "And you've shown me that love doesn't have to be something to fear," he said, his voice low, sincere. "I will never leave you, Charlotte. You have my word." Charlotte's heart swelled at his words. She had never known such certainty, such security. For so long, she had been drifting, unsure of where she belonged, unsure of who she could trust. But now, with the Duke by her side, she knew she had found her place. "I trust you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I ever thought possible." The Duke's eyes softened, his thumb brushing gently over her hand. "And I trust you, Charlotte. I always will." The silence between them was filled with understanding, with a bond that had been built on shared trust and vulnerability. There were no grand gestures, no declarations of love, just the quiet certainty that this was where they were meant to be. As the night deepened, they stood there, side by side, the future stretching out before them like an open road, filled with endless possibilities. Together, they would face whatever came their way, knowing that no matter what happened, they would have each other. And for the first time, Charlotte truly believed that love, trust, and happiness were not only possible, but something she could hold in her hands, right there, in that moment. Months passed, and with each passing day, Charlotte found herself more at home in the Duke's world. The doubts that once plagued her heart had all but disappeared, replaced by a quiet certainty that this was where she was meant to be. Their relationship, once fragile and uncertain, had blossomed into something strong and steady. Charlotte no longer questioned her place beside him. The Duke, too, had shown her more of himself than she had ever thought possible. The distance that had once marked their interactions was gone, replaced by a deep understanding between them. He was no longer just a man of power and influence to her. He was her partner, someone she could trust with her heart. The estate, once so vast and overwhelming, now felt like a home. She had begun to take part in its daily workings, her presence no longer an anomaly, but a natural part of the rhythm of the place. She spent her days walking through the gardens with the Duke, sharing long conversations by the fireplace, and learning the intricacies of his world. But despite the peace they had found, Charlotte knew that their future would not be without its challenges. The world beyond the estate still held its expectations, its judgments, and its whispers. Society would always be watching, and the Duke's past would always be a shadow over their future. Still, Charlotte felt a quiet confidence that they would face whatever came together. The Duke had proven himself to be a man of his word, and she had come to understand that love, when built on trust, could withstand even the harshest trials. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Charlotte felt a sense of calm settle over her. The flowers around them were in full bloom, the colors vibrant in the warm sunlight. The Duke sat beside her, his arm resting casually around her shoulders, his gaze soft as he looked out over the estate. "Charlotte," he said after a long silence, his voice low and steady, "I want you to know that you are the best thing that ever happened to me. You've given me something I didn't think I deserved, hope. I thought I had lost the ability to care for someone, to love. But with you, everything is different." Charlotte looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. She had never imagined that she could make such an impact on someone, that she could be the one to bring change to a man like him. She had spent so many years doubting herself, questioning her worth, but with him, she felt seen. Truly seen, for the first time in her life. "I never thought I could trust someone the way I trust you," she said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "You've shown me that love doesn't have to be something to fear. You've shown me that I can be myself and still be loved." The Duke's eyes softened, and he gently pulled her closer, wrapping his arm more firmly around her shoulders. "You are exactly who you are meant to be, Charlotte," he said, his voice full of quiet certainty. "And I will love you for exactly that." The world around them seemed to fall away as they sat there, side by side, in perfect harmony. Charlotte had found something she had never known she needed, a love that was real, a love that was true. And as the sun set over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the land, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The future, once uncertain and daunting, now felt full of promise. Together, they had built something worth fighting for, and Charlotte was ready to take on whatever the world had in store for them, as long as she had him by her side.